This building on the R&B campus is so green it's got 4 stars, but what makes a building 4-star isn't as obvious as you might think. Yes, it's well built and well insulated and faces the right way, all of those tick box exercises, but it turns out green buildings are actually a lot more subtle and a lot more complicated than you might think. And in the world of ESG, it's not just about the environment, it's about a lot of social and governance issues as well. On this episode, what makes a building green, and why is it that the average lifespan of a South African office building is around 25 years before it gets ripped down and replaced by something else? Lots to learn as to how green buildings fit into the world of ESG. Where do we sit as South Africa in the global context from a green buildings perspective?
So Bruce, I think one of the realities about operating in South Africa is that we're dealing with an increasingly expensive and increasingly unreliable power supply. So as real estate practitioners, owners and operators, there's been a big push to reduce net energy consumption. Similarly, the transition into more reliable and sort of clean energy sources has been accelerated. So in many aspects, we are ahead of the curve. I think from a accountability, transparency, from an accreditation perspective, as well as disclosure perspective, I think there is some way to go.
Okay, so let's just get this sorted out, Chatelain. What is a green building? Because, I mean, my concept of a building is you dig a great big hole in the ground, so you're destroying that little piece of the environment. You're then taking man-made steel and bricks and mortar, and the cement manufacturer is not particularly green either, and you're putting all of this together into a structure that is by no means green. Are we fooling ourselves when we start talking about green buildings, or is it once they're up, how they operate?
So I think that the principle of kind of being green and the ESG theme certainly extends beyond once the building's up. I think that there's the theme, obviously, of supply chain management, focusing on which buildings am I going to be producing, why am I going to be producing them in that area, what's the impact to the broader environment around the area. These are all considerations that come into the kind of ESG theme. Along with that is obviously the more practical considerations around what sort of materials do I use, how do I build sustainably for the future, how will the people who inherit this building from me one day need to manage it, are there sustainable kind of platforms and mechanisms in place in order for them to do so. So I think it's beyond what people believe to be kind of the practical outlook of what the building looks like and whether it looks green and whether the materials are green. I think there's a whole system behind that also needs consideration.
Are we over the national practice of we need a new building, so rip down whatever is there, chuck all of that stuff onto the scrap heap and rebuild? We seem to go through a cycle. Buildings in South Africa seem to have a life cycle of about 25 to 30 years, not much more than that.
So I think it's a theme that's going to become more relevant in the space as well, is kind of the tenant demand and tenants themselves becoming a lot more conscious. And I think we as a financial institution have the benefit of kind of sitting at the center of this and seeing the pressures that are being placed on capital providers, but also the users of these buildings, the tenants who themselves are going through quite kind of significant ESG journeys around what is their impact and what do they demand from the landlords that ultimately form part of our ecosystem. So I think it's difficult to kind of pull apart one player. This really is kind of a systemic consideration that all the players in the economy are grappling with and deciding how do we take this forward, what's going to be our contribution, what's going to be our impact.
I'd also add to that, I think from a spatial and time planning perspective, I think land scarcity has not necessarily always been an issue in the South African context.
We just go wider and bigger and further, yes.
Practicalities of that means that it puts a lot of a burden on infrastructure in terms of roads, piping for sewage, power supply, etc.
And we all spend a lot more time getting to and from where we're going to simply because the road networks aren't necessarily suited to this ever-increasing expansion?
Absolutely. So densification, particularly in the larger urban nodes, is a key theme, which means land availability is becoming an increasing issue for developers and property owners, which means repurposing and redevelopment will be a theme that will play out. I guess coming back to the ESG theme, some buildings are just antiquated in their design, the impact they have in terms of the way they interact with the environment and the levels of resources they consume. And in this aspect, we're speaking about water and power. So I think a lot of money will go into repurposing those buildings to retrofit them into, the new normal.
Absolutely. Danielle, are we seeing enough demand in South Africa for the greening of buildings? I won't say making them greener, not green, because I'm not too sure that's possible, but certainly making less of a negative impact on the environment.
I think we are, but not necessarily enough, Bruce, at this stage. I think if you think about how many commercial buildings are actually approved on a per annum basis, we're at like 1,400 according to Stats SA. And I think what you see is only a fraction of that, about 2 to 3% being certified as actual green buildings. But you do have the CBI coming to the fore saying, well, South Africa actually has a portfolio of about 5 billion to 100 billion on a per annum basis that could actually be certified as green. And it's quite disappointing to see that that stat is actually a lot lower than where it should be, because social diffusion theory does really speak to the fact that when we get to that 15% mark, we're kind of getting up to a place where we've got a social acceptance. But I do think the tides are changing. And I think net zero and the commitments that various tenants, which Dylan mentioned, are making, are directly going to impact the way that our real estate clients have to think about the greenness of their buildings. And I think you've got major players like the Green Building Council of South Africa, whose key mandate is to bring the certification schemes that actually help us understand how green an asset is to become more accessible and scalable in the market.
I want to talk about that certification in just a moment, but I remember, 10, probably 15 years ago now, Westbank built this green building along the highway. Where is it? It's sort of north of Joburg, Fairlands, there we go. And it faced in a particular direction, so it didn't get the sun beating into it at any given day, no air conditioning and vents to catch the prevailing winds. Have they had to put in air conditioning and make it comfortable, or has it worked?
Well, I think, when we think of green, we often only associate it with the E pillar within ESG. And we often fail to remember that green buildings also do compare a social aspect to it in terms of the social health of the people actually in that building. And that being said, I think the Discovery building, which is not too far away from where we are today, is certainly one of those standouts in terms of a 6-star green rating, one of the very few on the African continent. And it's also been one of the very first well building certifications that have actually been.
Okay, so how would they go about getting that 6 stars? Hard enough for a hotel to do. How does a corporate head office get certified? Who wants to pick up on the certification process?
Sure. So you often find that I think we as RMB are well positioned, as we do offer a little bit of ESG advisory to walk that journey with the clients. Because I'd be lying in telling you it isn't a journey, Bruce. As you rightfully point out, there's some hurdles that one needs to jump. Sure. But there are, of course, industry experts who walk the journey over and above us with the client, especially on the more technical detail. You'll find that there are a few that are more applicable in the South African and more broadly in African context. And that really speaks to IFC, taking into a very much account a nuanced geographical context. You've seen that the Green Star, which has been pioneered by the Green Building Council in South Africa, also currently very popular within the market because it does take into account that South African flavor. And I think you're seeing certain other certifications like LEED, WELL and Living Building Challenge also becoming increasingly popular amongst our real estate.
So, in order to get an extra star, do you put a running track on the roof? Or do you put dry cleaners and a Woolies inside the building so that your staff don't have to go out to go
would be great.
No, but that's what they've done at that Discovery building. It's an ecosystem, if you like, of once you arrive, you actually don't, unless you're going off to go and see a client or a client's coming to see you, you're not burning any carbon in the day to go and do your dry cleaning or do the household shopping, for example. That surely is a contributing factor, yeah?
You touched on some of the advanced technological changes and some of the design considerations that the FirstRand Group would have taken in building the Westbank building. We're seeing so much more of that with our clients. It is actually the norm. For example, in the residential space, you've got the EDGE certification criteria, and that effectively takes into account the construction process, the resources used, the environmental impact throughout the process, as well as the ongoing consumption in terms of the materials used.
You can't go, for example, and do a substantial renovation on a property which requires an architect's set of plans that need to be approved by council and not replace single-pane windows with double panes, for example, from an energy consumption point of view. So we're seeing that in the residential space, and that surely is then playing out also in the corporate space as well.
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think that the people's natural tendency is to focus on the office market, where it feels like there is big opportunities in order to kind of see some of the advances in green buildings and the like. But I think that there are a host of other kind of property-specific sectors that are also doing some deep thinking around what this means for them, and the inclusion of the S obviously comes into that in the South African context, which has its own challenges around housing and the like. So social housing, affordable housing, these are all sectors which are kind of looking deeply into themselves and saying, how do we attract more capital towards these sectors? And obviously the ESG theme is critical and key in terms of how the world is looking around the allocation of capital.
I hear words like journey and thinking. I'm not hearing doing and acting. Where are we in the timeline of a transformation of green buildings?
So I think the transformation that we're seeing with our clients spans broader than that, I'd say. And I think that what we're seeing is a change in the conversation from one which is quite linear around the kind of outputs of what this can mean for me and my business, to something which is starting to look a bit more inward towards how does this align with the purpose of what we're trying to do as an organization? Does it align? How do we need to think about this? So I think where the ESG pillar, and I'm going to use the word pillar because I think it has been seen as a pillar within an organization, is now starting to kind of span across really setting the business up for where are we now, where are we driving the business in the future, and how's the future going to require us to think differently around our business. So I think the kind of inward thinking around purpose and where we're trying to build this business is starting to change the thinking from something which was kind of at the early stages, how do I fit into a reporting pillar or a sustainable finance pillar? It's something more meaningful that I think we're starting to see. And I think that shift is indicative of a broader sectoral focus on this, and something that the sector is going to have to come together and think about outside of kind of the individual components of I'm REIT A, I'm REIT B, I'm unlisted property counter A, but what do we as a sector need to do? How do we need to be a part of this journey? Which it is.
And what are they telling you, Danielle?
The journey is getting a bit more tangible now, to Dylan's point. So firstly, I think we've seen the shift towards ESG and therefore the shift towards a broader utilization of sustainable finance solutions. But over and above that, I think you're seeing your corporates wanting to tenant specifically green buildings, helping to drive up that demand, and their commitments towards wanting to be net zero and carbon neutral feeding into that demand for the actual tenanting of green buildings. So we talked a little bit earlier about the tiny adoption rate that we're seeing in South Africa, but we're actually anticipating as industry experts that by 2030, most new buildings should be developed in line with net zero standards. And by 2050, we further anticipate that all buildings, new and existing, should somewhat reach a stage where they're of green nature.
But again, that's also the cop-out, the great cop-out of ESG. Kind of, we're on our way, we're on a long journey. And,
yes.
and this is a journey where people are crawling, not even walking, not even running. And I wonder why we can't accelerate this process. If we are saying to people, your buildings need to have the certain certifications, why we can't do it by 2030? Why do we have to wait, another quarter of a century?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think I'll paraphrase a little bit of what Barack Obama says, in that we're the first generation experiencing the ramifications of climate change, but we're also the last generation that has the ability to do something to significantly move that. So I'm hearing from you, in which I agree with, that there needs to be a little bit more of an urgency. But to be fair, I think taking into account the South African context, the theme of ESG has only recently emerged as a top priority. And that being said, like with any market in its nascency developing, it will unfortunately take take us some time to actually get into gear. That being said, I full-heartedly agree that for as long as we don't reach a place of being net zero, we'll continue to contribute towards global warming. So we're very enthused by our clients who are making shorter dated commitments around 2030, and we're certainly hoping through our solutions to incentivize our clients to get there even faster.
That's the power of the funding model, though. And it is up to you guys, Riyadh, to really incentivize a broader mindset when it comes to businesses trying to reach net zero.
Absolutely. So I think as an institution, and I guess keeping in line with a lot of the themes that have played out globally, we've really moved away from being a shareholder-centric organization to being a stakeholder-centric organization. And that's something we hold quite in quite high regard at a FirstRand level. But generally, we're seeing that theme play out at a client level too, in a sense that they're embracing stakeholder-related themes in the way they operate and in the way they justify and make investment decisions. So really what we're seeing is an economic imperative from a client perspective to make sure that the product that they provide, in this case either property to sell or property to rent, has a great product market fit. And to get the right fit for your tenants, you really do need to provide ESG sound solutions. In terms of the structuring component on our side, as a bank, we act as a conduit as well as a provider of capital. So a link of those who need capital and those who have capital. And really by incentivizing the adoption of ESG, we're able to drive the right behavior. We hope that some of the efforts and some of the green loans and sustainability-linked finance products we're able to put together, we can not only facilitate our clients in adopting ESG practices, but in the long run have a greater societal impact.
Dylan, you want to add to Riyadh's point?
I do. I think the point around incentivization is an interesting one, and I think it speaks to us being at the kind of earlier stages of adoption to some extent. I think the question is when the balance starts to shift from incentivization to exclusionary behavior. And I think that is not something that is limited to the providers of capital. I think it's this principle again around understanding the value chain for property companies and understanding all the stakeholders within that chain and how quickly they are moving within their own individual processes, and that the supplier of services to them might become harder in terms of what the expectations are, and the behavior might shift from incentivization to exclusionary.
But don't you sometimes want to just grab them and shake them just a little bit? It's like, guys, you do realize what we're up against here.
I think it is. I mean, I think the point around, we spoke earlier around numbers. How many properties currently do we think are still going to be around in 2050? It's a massive component of properties. So it is a balance between ensuring that what we are contributing to the market today is put forward in the right manner, and that we balance that with the existing stock in the market, which also has the need for reform, for regeneration, for renovation. And I think that a lot of the companies are going through that process now of thinking around what's the cost-benefit analysis in respect of that journey.
And we're in a small economy. I mean, we make up about 0.25% of global GDP. We've got glorious real estate sitting in the city centre of Johannesburg, in an area where people don't want to go anymore, to the extent that they might have in the 70s and 80s when those buildings were brand new. What happens to that real estate? I mean, there's a huge risk, of course, that it just deteriorates and deteriorates further, that it never gets rejuvenated and brought up to a standard to achieve this net zero. It strikes me that we've got a really big dichotomy in South Africa, where we're getting Rosebank and Sandton and parts of the Cape Town and parts of the outside of Durban doing brilliantly, but these inner cities are crumbling, Danielle, and it feels that that's a sharp contradiction to what we're trying to achieve with the move to net zero.
In terms of outdated buildings, I think obsolescence is certainly something that landlords and owners are definitely dealing with. There is a reality that certain buildings are, irreversibly beyond the point of being ESG compliant. But I think particularly in the South African context, the S is so important. The inner cities have always been a core point of gathering for a lot of people. It's we've got centralized transport networks that link into the city. So the need for infrastructure investment in those areas is so important. So the provision of affordable accommodation, the conversion of old tower blocks into residential rental stock or otherwise, is something that we could,
It's a really important point that you make there, because I was just listening to Grace Harding, who's the CEO of Ocean Basket, and they're going into the UK and they're going into buildings with which they're not familiar. In South Africa, it's a big concrete block, big open space, easy to place your kitchen and your tables and your reception desk. Suddenly you go into a building that was built in the 1800s and you have to adapt this building. I wonder if we should even be treating buildings as being obsolete. We just have to be smarter about the way in which we reconfigure them, surely. Certainly in wealthier countries, they seem to be very focused on that.
Absolutely. I think, again, in the South African context, land scarcity hasn't necessarily been a key consideration, but increasingly so because of the impact it has had on infrastructure. We have to focus on using what we've got to maybe redress the economic and environmental footprint that it may be having. So a lot of what you're seeing in Sandton at the moment is a redevelopment and repurposing theme around converting some of the old office buildings into...
And when you say old office buildings, these are 20-year-old buildings. Yes. Which are now obsolete for the purpose for which they were designed, but are being repurposed in weird and wonderful ways. Yeah. We look at this issue of ESG, and we can't just look at buildings from an ESG perspective as an E.
Correct.
The social aspect of the stock that is available, and buildings which are either obsolete or past their initial use, are useful for something else. Okay. And that's a huge component, surely, of this moving towards the just transition, as we put it, Danielle.
Absolutely. And I think we don't have to divorce the S when we talk about a building being greener, right? Because I think Riyadh touched on the fact that when a building is greener, it's less resource intensive, meaning your two key environmental metrics being your water and your energy usage, which a lot of South Africans spend a lot of money on, tend to actually come down over time. And in the residential market, you see that there's these operational efficiencies which create operational savings for our clients. And these are particularly important, as Riyadh mentioned, on our inner city developments that we focus on, which also provide an affordable housing solution, now creating additional benefit for the clients that tenant that.
And apartheid spatial planning put black people a million miles away from work and said, well, you can come in on a bus every day. Well, the buses don't work, minibus taxis do, but people are generating an enormous carbon footprint coming in and huge expense coming into their places of work.
Absolutely.
You put people close to where they work, and that has then a greener component to it, surely.
So proximity to transport is exactly one of the characteristics that actually goes into monitoring whether a building is indeed green or not. Perhaps it's assessed a little bit more from, as you say, the carbon that it takes you to actually get from point A to point B, but we also now consider access to education facilities for parents and working families, access to child health care, as well as accessibility to work, which then helps you generate some income to actually tenant all those wonderful buildings.
Danielle, I'm glad you brought up the concept of accessibility. I think if you had to take a look at the peri-urban or rural retail economy, those centres typically act as, platforms for people to access services that they ordinarily would have to jump into a bus or taxi or car and drive many miles away to achieve. So we've got healthcare facilities, we've got government departments, banking, and all sorts of services that are incorporated into the design of retail facilities to really be community centres. And that really strikes a chord with the S and the ESG.
I think it's absolutely pivotal to have a holistic view here, Ryan, as we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that this is the wave of thinking. I think that the thinking started predominantly in the East space, and I think it was driven by...
the structure must be green. It must use these materials. It must face this direction and use little electricity. Excellent tick, but it's much more complicated.
I think it's to your last point, it started as a tick. And I think it's moving away from a tick. I think it's moving to really understand how this is a new way of driving business forward. This is a new way around thinking what's my role in the economy? What's my role as an employer? What's my role as kind of providers of development opportunities to the environments and the communities around me? And that thinking, I think, is what we're seeing, really as the shift. And the sustainable finance is one small component of that, an important component, but a small component. And it's a journey that we need to partner with. I think that it requires a lot of engagement between, stakeholders. Our clients as the real estate, the holders or custodian of real estate assets. It requires engagement between themselves, between their stakeholders, the people who are renting the buildings from them, the people who are impacted by the way that they operate in the market. So I think that the more engagement there is on this, the better we're going to be able to define what it is that we can do and the impact that we really can have within our own spaces and based on the roles that we play.
Dylan, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Danielle, and thank you, Riyad, as well. That is an interesting perspective when it comes to the concept of a green building. It's not as simple as it's held up to be. Thanks for watching.